Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, everyone. This is Dylan sitting in the host chair once again. We're continuing our saga of an American monarchy. Before we get started, I just want to give a quick disclaimer. If it sounds like we don't remember what we talked about last time, it's because we only half do. We're not big on continuing notes in this podcast. We just like to see where things go. So apologies for any internal inconsistencies that we have. We do our best to remember, and that's not very good, but we don't care. We're going to keep doing it anyway. Just to give a quick refresher of where we left off last time, we last time explored the reign of the Constantine of the House of Romanov, our Russian monarch, and we ended right at his death, kind of in 1847, 1848. We ended with an America that has acquired vast swaths of territory, a lot of the same territory that we had in our timeline, but in a much earlier fashion. In this version of 1840s America, you're looking at an America that has basically all of the West from the Louisiana Purchase. We have Russian Alaska that we purchased. We have at least some claim to the Columbian Corridor, although its exact legality is indeterminate and undecided, so that may come back to haunt us this episode. We have California, having gone to war with the Empire of Mexico. We also have Baja California and Veracruz and some other bits and pieces of Mexico, but those are the big ones. We also have the Caribbean. So we've got Cuba, Hispaniola, a couple of those other territories in there from our first wars of the first coalition against Spain in the early days of this American monarchy. So just to give you an idea of the territorial extent, that's where we are. We also have a much kind of more sectionally divided America. We have a more complicated definition of slavery than we had in our own timeline. Last episode, we kind of talked about, not just having chattel slavery in the South, but also these various versions of Spanish colonial slavery, things like mestizos and the problems that come, with how do you define those groups of people. Religion is also not to be discounted in this timeline. We've had a much stronger Catholic presence because of a Catholic king, as well as a German Protestant king and a Russian Orthodox king, although the Russian Orthodoxy didn't come up all that much. So we have a larger but more fragmented America that we're dealing with as we set the stage in 1847, 1848 at the death of Constantine Romanov. And now, as is our tradition with every episode of this podcast, at least with this series, we have to figure out who's the new head man in charge. And conveniently enough, since we're dealing with the revolutions of 1848, I'm going to throw this to Chris Coppola. Chris, do you have a phrase to say before we get started?
Hi, good people.
Chris is going to get us started, and then we also are going to hear from Evan Buck and Robert Koshu on this episode. Chris, you have some thoughts on who our new monarch is going to be.
So,
I was wondering if anyone would catch that.
I wasn't going to say anything, but I'm like, I see what you did there.
No, everybody knows I'm gonna get that one. So 1848. In Europe, it's kind of a big year. The French, the Austrian monarchies are both overthrown. There's revolutions in multiple German states. And at this point, we have the beginnings of the wars of Italian unification. At this point, the House of Savoy, the Kingdom of Sardinia, which actually also includes a decent-sized chunk of northwestern Italy, begins its wars against Austria and the Austrian vassal states in northern Italy. That really begins the process of making Italy a single unified political entity. And one of the things we talked about is the idea that in all of these, whenever we've had a change, we literally got one of the brothers of Frederick the Great. We brought in one of the brothers of Napoleon Bonaparte. We brought in actually a son of Alexander who defeated Napoleon. The United States, whenever it's picking its next king, is always trying to pick a European power on the upswing. And we sat here and talked through all of this, and we said we think the House of Savoy would be an interesting pick because at this point, the United States, looking at European politics, sees the old multinational empires are having a lot of problems, and you're starting to see monarchical nation states. And Italy is one of the first to really move to it's one of the first to start unifying. France had always been kind of the nation state, but at this point, Italy is starting down that road, and the United States, in our timeline here, invites in Prince Ferdinando, who is the son of the current king of Sardinia, but is the brother of the eventual king of a unified Italy, Victor Emmanuel. So we bring in Prince Ferdinando of the House of Savoy, and let's go.
And before we hop down this road, and by the way, for those of you listening to this podcast, I am a little bit under the weather, so if you do hear a little bit of that, my apologies for sounding like a hoarse frog at certain points. But I will do my best to, nevertheless, he persisted. I'm just going to say, I'm going to throw in a very quick little interesting historical side note character, because like we mentioned, I think a couple episodes back, we're not super fond of having just a unanimous decision necessarily per se in American politics, because that is not so much the American way. So even though at this point in our timeline, we do like to have, hitch our wagon to the star of the upstart European royal monarchs, I'm going to throw in the just for sake of it, the competitor to Prince Ferdinando. One very inspirational little rabble-rouser and agitator from Germany who actually came over to our fair shores in our timeline right in 1848. His name is Friedrich Hecker. He's a lawyer and revolutionary, and I think he's going to try to be the last gasp of German influence really trying to exert itself here strongly in America, but I don't think it's going to succeed. It'll kind of be like in our timeline with Ulysses S. Grant and the Democrats being in disarray, and we had Horace Greeley of the National Republicans, kind of trying to give some sort of resistance. I think it'll kind of be something along those lines as well. But I just wanted to throw that in here to have something mirror our timeline in the alternate timeline.
Yeah, and I think this sets up the succession of Ferdinando and the whole situation in 1848 presents a really interesting opportunity for this America, because in this timeline we're talking about an America that tends to try and figure out which of the European players is the most powerful, is the most ascendant at any given time. And I think it's, especially in the aftermath of 1848, you have this kind of impression of at least a sort of stagnation of, the historic major players in the early 1800s. The British are obviously doing their thing, but they're kind of more isolated from the continent. They're doing their colonial, proto-Victorian expansion at this point. The French are, well, no offense to our French listeners, but the French are being French. The Germans are, dealing with the aftermath of 48 and the, the seismic changes into what was, for most of the Middle Ages, the preeminent German empire in the Habsburgs. So the Italians kind of make the most logical next step up, because nobody's going to pick a Spanish Habsburg chin to be the king. That's just not happening. So I do think that puts us in a really interesting position, and it kind of gives us a clean slate in terms of Europe, because we have some of the leftover feelings from earlier kings and the diplomatic relations, but we don't have any real, current ties that we're dragging in. If we have an Italian king, this is essentially a new polity that's got, a complete unfettered sort of discretion to do what it's going to do in terms of foreign relations. So I think that puts us in a really interesting spot.
And the other thing I liked about doing an Italian at this point, and we talked about it, is this is 60-ish years after the revolution. The people that have any living memory are dying off, but the connection to the classical Roman world is something that people the founding fathers loved, and I think this offers a continuity to that.
Yeah.
Well, and not only that, but at this point we've also had a huge Irish immigration. Mm-hmm. So now we've also bumped our Catholic population. Mm-hmm. And in this timeline, I actually think that Catholic immigration, the Italian and the Irish moving in, is even higher, because we have more of a standard monarchy, a standard setup of things to go. We don't have the landed gentry like you have, so you still have kind of our open freedom, but you've got more of a classical look, so people are moving in, and we've got a bigger Catholic influence. And I'm sorry, but there's nothing more Catholic than grabbing the Italian at this point.
Well, that, and a good thing to bring up, especially Irish immigration. This is the sort of tail end of the worst of the Great Hunger at the end of the Irish potato famine, and this is the beginning of all this Irish immigration over. And we have to remember, in this timeline, this is an America that does not have this sort of rapprochement with the British, the kind of uneasy, not amiable, but at least tolerable sort of relations. This is an America where we have made noises about British Columbia and sort of the West Coast and the Vancouver area to try and link up with Alaska. So this is, for the Irish population that really doesn't like the UK, instead of the Irish population that just doesn't normally like the UK, this is going to be a much more attractive place to emigrate.
Keeping in mind, even in our timeline, between 1914 and 1917, when Great Britain is fighting against Germany by itself, with help, the Irish communities in the United States still were opposed to joining the war on the side of Great Britain. Mm-hmm. And that is 70 years, 2-3 generations removed from this.
Yeah.
The people right off the boat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And let's keep in mind, with the Italian monarch also works pretty well, because I'm just going to say we have had a couple of monarchs hailing from countries at this point that have claimed to be, at one point, the successor to Rome. So if we actually have the place where Rome literally is at, I think that just continues the line down the road. I see Chris laughing in the corner. It's like, well, it continues the line perfectly.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. They claim the entire peninsula. They don't have Rome yet, but yeah,
they don't have it, but they're working on it. They're getting there. Before we move on, I just want to hop on something really quick, just so I understand correctly something that Robert, you said. You mentioned that there's no like landed gentry at this point. I had listened to all of the second episode in this arc before we hopped on to this podcast, and I remember you mentioning that we basically would use Louisiana and the Caribbean as like an open valve to be able to give a landed gentry land. So unless I forgot something in episode 3.
I forgot about that.
Yeah. So I wanted to make sure we brought that up, because I figured there still is a landed gentry, but where did we go from there?
But I talk about, I think we remember, does anybody remember, I want to say it was Far and Away. It was like a Tom Cruise, Nicole Kidman movie. Does this ring a bell for anyone?
You're going to have to be more specific if you're talking about Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman movies.
That one, yes, unfortunately it does. Only because they redid the Oklahoma Land Rush in that movie.
And it's about basically an Irish immigrant couple that comes over and kind of settles, in this case, Oklahoma. But I think the point is, and we've talked about this a little bit in previous episodes, because the U.S. is so much bigger and geographically dispersed, there is enough territory and economic activity and a variety of economic modalities to allow for a co-opted or implanted aristocracy in the Caribbean, while at the same time having freehold small farmers in what is to become Kansas and Nebraska and Oklahoma and Iowa. So those are so we still have land that makes sense to have small immigrant holdings on.
We have the best of both worlds.
I was going to say
because the other part of it is in this timeline, and I don't think we've talked about the Native Americans much in this timeline, but the way this timeline is playing out, as little as I would say we had a little tolerance for them in our timeline, I think in this timeline there becomes zero tolerance.
I think it's
for rogue Indians. Oklahoma is set up, and everybody gets their little heinies to Oklahoma. And if you come off the federal, I almost view it as an escape from New York look around Oklahoma, that the U.S. Army basically camps around Oklahoma and just dares an Indian to leave it. At this point,
pretty much.
I think there's at least some of that. Although I do wonder if we have an increased prevalence toward Western settlement with your sort of, to use an analogy that's 30 years after this, your sort of proverbial 40 acres and a mule. I do wonder if there would at least be some encouragement towards Indians, at least more than in our timeline, trying to get them, instead of a reservation system, to that sort of more small freehold system. It's kind of one of those things that I don't know that it's going to matter one way or the other, but it's an interesting economic sort of distinction to make in terms of the philosophy of this timeline.
How about this? This is just a crazy thought that I had as you guys were talking. But what if, and this is something that I think is the perfect segue to a topic that I know we wanted to hit on in our pre-gaming, but what if this is a way for the Indians to kind of relate to another different kind of oppressed minority that is also happens to be pushing out west around this time, and that's the Mormons.
That's exactly where I was going.
So I first, I have a legitimate question. I want to have a discussion as to, are the Mormons an oppressed minority that is pushed out west?
Yes.
We have talked about in this scenario a much more religiously pluralistic America.
They are still too.
Okay.
Yeah, I think
they're still too crazy for.
Okay.
Because they have one little peccadilla that forces everybody's hand on them.
Yeah.
I think it's anything goes as long as you are not polygamous.
There you go.
The Catholic sentiment, I think, makes that stronger. Also, this is also in the 1840s. The Mormons in our timeline have already been kind of moving west. Mm-hmm. This is actually the time in which Joseph Smith dies in a riot, a riot that actually leads to him getting shot while he's in prison on trial for treason. This is when Brigham Young kind of takes over and begins the journey to Utah. Interestingly enough, a guy who is in Missouri at this time, this is kind of a little aside, but I have a feeling it'll come up later. The guy who negotiates with Brigham Young for the truce that lets Young lead the Mormons out to Utah is a guy who becomes much more famous later as a senator who goes on the stump, literally debating all over the country against this weird gangly kid from Kentucky in 1858, Stephen Douglas. So all that to say, I do think the Mormons end up going out west, and Evan, that was a perfect setup because I was actually trying to get to the westward expansion is sort of the next thorn, because I don't think a new king is not going to want to go to war immediately, especially in the aftermath of 48. I think domestic policy is going to be kind of his premier, at least earlier focus. And that leads us to the obvious question of what does westward expansion in the midst of all this land that we've got look like? I know we've talked about, kind of Kansas, Nebraska. I think in a prior episode, we talked about how some of those states like Minnesota, Kansas, Nebraska would actually already be states, at least a few of them, because we don't have this kind of tete-a-tete, one for one thing where we have to worry about slave states versus free states because we have so much land that we can just say, oh, we'll do it later. And Texas got broken up. So I think we're looking at earlier states that aren't still very populous, but that does lead us to some interesting questions of like, okay, well, what is, do the Mormons go to Utah? Do they go somewhere else? What happens?
Does Deseret happen?
I think Deseret does happen.
I think
because
so.
I think when you have that much territory, I think there's kind of a mutual understanding that at least in the short term, I think Deseret happens because it's one of those things where they want to get somebody out there, especially looking across against the Mexico, who lost a bunch of territory in a more militaristic sense than our timeline. I mean, you can say what you will about how actually amicable the Gadsden purchase was, but at least we did the pretense of buying it off of them, parts of it. Here, we did not do that. So I think at least in the short term, 5 to 10 year horizon, we need warm bodies and we need them out west. And if you want to take multiple wives with you, that's kind of weird from a Catholic Italian monarch perspective. But it also means you're going to be popping out more kids and get more people out there quickly. So I think what happens with Deseret in the long term is a kind of a titillating question. But in the short term, I very much see them just being like, get out of Missouri, go somewhere west, stay there. As long as you don't shoot other Americans, we don't care what you do.
Yeah, I think it's very likely. I think I believe we established that Southern and Northern California already happened at this point, if I'm correct.
Yeah, at
so
least
Deseret basically, because I'm looking at the outline of Deseret right now.
And Deseret becomes a slave state. It's a slave territory.
Does it?
Brigham Young was a proponent of slavery.
That is true.
Okay.
During
I
this,
can see that.
So it stays slavery, and the negotiation ends up being, in my head, the negotiation being, you cannot broadcast your polygamy, but we'll let you stay in and be. You can't talk about it as long as it's happening just there and you're not bragging about it.
Don't ask, don't tell.
So what you're
there
you're
you go.
is,
Yeah, exactly.
Because Deseret would have encompassed the territory that includes Las Vegas.
No, that's
what
what
happens in
say.
Deseret stays in Deseret.
Yes. Exactly. And here's the thing. Why don't we have Deseret minus Southern California? Because I'm just looking at the map, and the proposed state of Deseret also includes what we already have as Southern California. It also is roughly analogous to the piece of Arizona that does not have the Gadsden purchase. So whether or not Gadsden actually happens, whether we purchase it or just take it over, because we're Americans, baby, and we don't care so much about spending money to get territory. I like this Deseret minus SoCal.
Yeah. And I think at this point the borders are vague enough that nobody's really worried about
who's really
they have a core territory, but nobody's really worried about is Southern California part of Deseret, or the edges of the territory don't matter so much as the nucleus, I think, which is going to lead into tensions later. But for early 1850s, I think it's more just a practicality of get people out there. Mm-hmm. But that only deals with sort of the Southwest. We've still got to figure out everything west of Minnesota, and this is the Dakotas are still very much in, Lakota hands and, some of the other Great Plains tribes. So, that's kind of also another interesting place to go, because we don't know that there's gold there yet. We do know we have all this land and not enough Americans on it.
So the one thing I think maybe Deseret looks like Utah.
Yeah.
Because of what you talked about. Nevada came into existence to cut out of Mormon territory because of the silver discoveries there.
Yeah.
So I think that I think they may.
I think that's going to come up that's going to be the earliest sort of pushback on the extent of the Mormon territory.
Okay.
Is some of those mineralogical discoveries. Same thing with Southern California. I think it's going to be, the Mormons might have some claim to it originally under Deseret, but I think, as the 1850s certainly go on, especially with all the gold miners that are going out there, I think that's going to be the point of contention between an American administration and a Mormon administration. Yeah.
Yeah. And it really becomes, and honestly, to keep the arguments and to keep things down here is, you want to keep being polygamous, or you want to give us a little bit more land? Take your choice.
And as the resident Southern Californian, I'm just going to say Southern California has centuries of history at this point as being what? A primarily Spanish/Mexican Catholic entity. So giving this to a new state of Deseret is probably just going to be a no-go, especially for an Italian monarch.
Yeah. Yep. I do think that Deseret and Brigham Young being out there in this period, especially with a sort of Southern California on the other end where we know there's gold, I do think, and this is kind of a historical parallel to our timeline, I think the fact that the Mormons have control of Deseret with not necessarily government like official approval, but with kind of a tacit understanding, I do think this accelerates some of the discussions over a transcontinental railroad, because you have Brigham Young being able to essentially act kind of in the place of, or an earlier version of the UP was from the eastern side, the Southern Pacific was from the western side, or am I getting that backwards? Southern Pacific was coming from California. Brigham Young, I'm imagining in this timeline, acts as kind of the link in the middle that saves the UP and the SP from having to get all the way to Promontory Point, because Brigham Young can meet them from both sides. Yeah. So I'm wondering if you have at least some version of an earlier transcontinental railroad, or at least moves towards a transcontinental railroad in this timeline.
Well, and here's the thing as well, because we're talking about a much more Irish, much more Italian, and we also have the 48ers still that happened like in our timeline. So a big German brain drain basically coming over here. So kind of a more, even though it's more the religious social character of the nation is more diverse, one would say. I would also say it has more of this like Catholic focus, Catholic emphasis, given the people that are coming over here. So my question is in our timeline, like I think I might have mentioned 1 or 2 episodes before in this arc, the Irish are not seen as white people in our timeline for a while.
Nor the Italians, actually.
And nor the Italians. So we are flipping this entirely on its head in this timeline, where now we have the Italians, the Irish, and the Germans basically being the most populous, or at least the ones with the most sway, I would say, in a lot of ways. So do we have a lot of Irish immigrants going out west and helping build the railroad? I don't know if that happens.
I think so. Are you saying because they have more social cachet?
There's no reason for them to have to be shipped out west, is what I would say.
I think they are, just because I don't think the social cachet changes the economic realities of the immigrant experience for them.
Yeah, because a lot of them are so poor coming off the boat. They need to, I think
they need the 40 acres and a mule.
Yeah, I think
that is true.
I do think there's different treatment of them. I think
it's probably different treatment, but maybe it still happens in a similar manner.
And I think that ends up.
I could go with that.
Yeah, I think that ends up leading towards a more interesting makeup of the expansion. I think you're going to see a lot more, Garibaldis and Facettis and Canales, all these other people.
No, I don't think you are, and I'll tell you why.
You don't think you're going to have a lot of Italians out west building a railroad?
No, and here's why. If you look at the pattern of Italian immigration, one, it was almost exclusively from the South, from the Kingdom of Naples.
Yeah.
Two, it was predominantly triggered by the economic displacement of Italy becoming a single economic unit, which
Okay.
hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, you're right. Okay. Yeah. So never mind. You don't have as many Italians, but you do have more Irish in
Yes.
for the southwestern states. And I'm
Yes.
kind of envisioning an extension of sort of what happens in our timeline where the Great Plains states are still, predominantly more German expansion, just with slightly more Catholic Germans than necessarily sort of Protestant Northern Germans.
Mhm.
So do we want to say maybe like, Minnesota is already a state by this time. Maybe we add in, East and West Dakota or Dakota and.
No, I think Dakota was kind of, I think the Dakotas were admitted post-Civil War specifically to cut up Republican states.
Yeah.
Yep.
So we've got plenty of territory.
Yeah.
Call
We don't
back
need
to
to.
the 1876 episode where we kind of agreed that the Dakotas would come together as one state.
Yep.
I think that happens here.
That's
Mhm.
kind of what I'm thinking. But I'm thinking, how far west do we go with this sort of jump-started westward expansion? I don't think we get all the way to, like, I'm not saying, Jackson Hole and Butte are like big, metropolitan centers in this timeline, but like the Dakotas might be a state by now.
I'm gonna be a horrible person. Shout out Scott Hardenbrook. I every single time I call out a friend of mine from work. Boise is gonna become a freaking like New Dublin. Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
I don't know where to take that. I'm just going to completely move on and just not address it. It's
Cool.
I'm happy he hasn't brought up the Bass Pro
I mean,
yet.
hey,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's just
Yeah.
last word.
Well, okay.
make a joke.
Idaho is known for its potatoes, so
It is.
there you go.
There you go.
It fits perfectly.
The Bass Potato Farm.
Yeah.
So I guess so we've kind of covered the southern end of out west, and we've kind of covered sort of the beginning of the Black Hills and sort of the northern Great Lakes. That really, I guess, kind of leads us into the last big remaining piece on the board, which it makes sense because you figure it's probably been 5-6 years since Fernando has taken the throne. It's about time he may stop looking entirely inwardly and start looking at foreign policy.
Mhm.
So we'll just say the Pacific Northwest comes a calling. From our last episode, we had, kind of a detente. We had claims on Colombian areas and sort of BC and Vancouver and that kind of area.
We have San Juan Island already.
54-40 or fight.
We
That was
pretty
the
much looked
timeline.
at it and said, nope.
Because we inherit, and the
George
reason,
Pickett grabbed it and kept it.
yeah, because we have all these Russian colonial forts that we inherited when we purchased Alaska during the Romanov throne. So because we have a much more solid claim to this area, not from a diplomatic perspective, but from a pure ownership and negotiation perspective, I think that then becomes the next interesting piece on the board. So
I have a way to handle it. I think I have a really interesting thing here.
okay.
So Evan kind of threw out 54-40 or fight, which was a campaign slogan for, I want to say, James K. Polk.
I'm pretty sure it's James K. Polk.
Basically
Polk, yeah.
that was going to be the northern border. That line of longitude was going to be the border between the United States and Canada. And it didn't wind up being exactly that, but between some negotiations, the northern border of today was settled. I think so. Dylan kind of laid out a timeline of kind of 54, 55-ish. You have the United States starting to try and claim this. I think that holds off a little bit. And, it gets bogged down. I think in 1857, there's a bum rush. The United States rushes the Colombian area and takes it over because the British are busy in India. That is when the Indian Mutiny happens. And basically the local British troops that the East India Company had been employing in India rise up against the company, and the British Empire. The British, we talked about this a little bit with the United States. The British Empire functioned similarly, where when there was a problem somewhere, you normally could get a couple of months of free reign against the British, because they were thin on the ground in a lot of different places. You saw it in India at this point. You also see it in, for example, some of the Afghan wars, and you see it in the Boer War. But, let's call forward to our next episode. The Empire always strikes back.
Hey.
And once news reaches London of something, they kind of marshal their forces and send troops somewhere. But they can handle one thing at a time. And I think if the British are preoccupied keeping India, they're not going to be occupied keeping British Columbia.
And I really like this. I really like this too, because we have a sooner transcontinental railroad under this timeline.
We have a whole bunch of people that are looking to get their own
literally
back.
looking to get their own 40 acres and a mule.
Well, and since we've already talked about Oklahoma, the Sooners have to do something because they're not Sooners in this timeline.
Yep.
And we have a vested interest in connecting Alaska.
Yeah, we need to connect. That section
did not necessarily have.
Yeah.
I think end up having in our timeline, I guess we could say.
I think, one of the interesting things about the whole this American monarchy path has done is it has really changed what happens in America, and it has made the rest of the world matter in a way that maybe it didn't in our timeline.
Yeah.
The Peninsular Campaign is why we have the Caribbean. The Indian Mutiny is why we have British Columbia. And I think that's a really interesting change that just happens to be happening. But I think, if the British are preoccupied, and by this point you've got a significant American population that is happy to do this.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it makes perfect sense. I didn't realize there was such a good justification for it. But that is, it's from a geopolitical perspective, it's the perfect opportunity because it allows you to sneak in the back door and get something while the British are busy without having to worry about trying to fight what is at this point the largest empire in the world.
And at the end of the day, now Britain's been fighting a war. Maybe we decide we own it. Maybe we'll cut you a check, let you pay your soldiers off.
This could be like the Gadsden Purchase.
Yeah,
this could be our Gadsden Purchase. Which again, I keep liking how
the Columbia Purchase is the Gadsden.
We're shifting a lot of what happened and how we handled the Southwest in our timeline up to the Northwest.
Yeah. Yep. So that then accomplishes essentially by 1860 this sort of complete contiguation, to use a word that I think I just made up, of the American, empire, essentially. You got it from Florida and Cuba and Hispaniola in the southeast all the way up to the tip of the Aleutians in the northwest, one continuous landmass that is America. The problem that we have now set ourselves up for is that it is not very consistent, is the word I'm going to use. It's very uneven in terms of demographics and religion. So I think that is going to become the discussion of the 1860s, which is interesting because it ties in with, in the 1850s in our timeline and the 1840s. This is the Great Awakening. This is the era of the great religious revivals. The Mormon Church was created. This is this new revival of religious experience in America. So if you have an America that's one, bigger, two, more people, a little more spread out, but still more people, and three, over the previous episodes of this
more
this
diverse
kind of timeline,
it's more religiously diverse,
but also more factional in a sense, because
yes.
you've had longer stretches of sort of government I don't want to say sponsorship, but sort of a government. You've had a French Catholic monarch, you've had a German Protestant monarch, all for 20, 25 year stretches,
and a Russian Orthodox monarch. So that the pendulum swing. What I'm really getting at, I guess, is the pendulum swings are longer between different sort of religious sort of support groups, and so the entrenchment, I think, in regions of the country has more ability to sort of solidify itself. I don't think it's necessarily problematic yet.
I'm not even sure. I think this may be almost the opposite of problematic, because you do not have a dominant WASP group at the top of this. Hey, let's dissect what WASP is. All right, white,
Protestant.
Anglo-Saxon. Anglo-Saxon does not mean what it does in our time. Protestant does not mean what it does in our time. So I think you've got a much more, not a factional, a pluralistic American religious environment where you can have new religious movements and them be accepted. And maybe that is kind of the outlet for some of the know-nothings, for some of the more native groups.
Here's the thing. I think, because I like how that's being developed, to push back slightly, here's the thing. Although we have bigger, longer swings, like what Dylan talks about, swings of the pendulum, even though we have more pluralism and we have more land to kind of have all of these different groups kind of pal around, coexist at least a little bit more harmoniously. We're talking about the Italian Catholic monarch being at the head at a very pivotal pivot point in American history. We also have, I would argue, a lot more Catholics coming on board to America during this time. And the last thing I'm going to mention, which is what I believe is going to establish the next couple of episodes and the name of this episode, a mini arc within an arc. We have in 1846 a new pope.
I was wondering how it was going to get into this episode.
You know what? That I already did in Empire Strikes Back. Like there's a couple of different points on this. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So what I'm trying to say is that we have more pluralism, right? We have more territory, but in terms of what is happening at this given point in our alternate timeline, we basically have what I would say is a pretty prominent, the longest verified serving pope in modern history. Pretty powerful influence in a coalescing Italian state. The embryonic form of that, I guess you can say, happening in Italy. We have an Italian monarch. We have Irish Catholics. We have Italian Catholics. We have German 48ers, who are, I think, kind of a mix of like Protestant, mainly Protestants, maybe some German Catholics too, as far as I recall. But the point is that although I think pluralism is more of a force and we have more land to play with, we have, I would argue, Catholics with their hands on the levers of power in one of the more important times of American history. So how that impacts things moving forward, I'm gonna leave open to the floor, because I'm not necessarily fully disagreeing with what you were saying, Chris, but I also think that whoever has the controls of the levers of the machinery at this point, I think has a very profound ripple effect.
So I think I'm going to say two things. First, I think it's interesting that we're recording this. We don't record and release in order, but we're recording this after we did the Cromwell episode. And I think there might be something to be said for kind of a role between the monarch and the Congress, that you can be whatever religion you want, but keep that out of this. The other thing would be this. Looking at what's happening on the Italian peninsula, earlier I pointed out that Italy does not, the political entity that becomes the Italian state does not control Rome at this point. The Pope controls the Papal States at this point.
Papal States, baby.
Yep.
And the House of Savoy comes into conflict, goes to war with the Papal States to unify Italy, because basically the Papal States cut across the middle of Italy. Sardinia, Savoy is up north. You have the southern region, the Kingdom of Two Sicilies, around Naples that wants to join, and those are two discontiguous parts of the peninsula, and the House of Savoy has to go to war with the Papal States to become a unified unit. So I think there's an argument to be made that maybe Ferdinando is a bit of a lapsed Catholic. It isn't exactly doing what the Pope says in this
I think it's a very
circumstance.
strong argument for that. Yes.
But I think that gets us to, so the inward and kind of administration deals with, I guess, the 1850s, but we haven't touched any foreign policy stuff. And speaking of the relation between the House of Savoy and the Italian peninsula, in 1859, the French and the Sardinians go to war with Austria over the Italian peninsular question. So, and, I don't know that we want or need to go into that particular war, although we can, but I think it presents an opportunity for Ferdinando to turn his eye back eastward, so to speak.
I think he's made a very happy life here, like so many other immigrants. His brother is in charge of that, and also, as I mentioned earlier, the United States functions a little bit like the British Empire. Even if we wanted to get involved in that, to actually get force projected all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. By the way, with a British Empire who is now no longer tied up with India.
With India, yeah,
they're done.
And
you don't want to mess with the English Navy at this.
And is very big on not maintaining a balance of power in Europe. So it's okay if new countries form, but they don't want to see Austria get beaten too badly. So I think we set that one out.
Yeah, and I don't think it's a war we necessarily get involved in. I think just because of the ties between Ferdinando and his brother, I think it's just a natural inflection point that forces him to sort of pay attention to Europe, at least in some sense. The Crimean War happens in the mid 1850s, but that's kind of an entirely sort of European Asian thing. So Ferdinando's not going to care about that, but something that directly involves his brother, I think even if he doesn't necessarily get militarily or diplomatically involved in, I think he has to at least pay attention to. So I think that may forcibly kind of turn his attention, not entirely away from internal stuff, but he's going to have to open his lens to the wider world. And it also, the early 1860s is also the French intervention in Mexico, which we've said in several different alternate timelines does not happen without the American Civil War. And I think is correct. But I think it does also bring up the idea of this is a world without the Monroe Doctrine. So we probably have something similar because of the sheer size of the American, territory. But we don't have a Monroe Doctrine that's sort of proclaimed and enforced in this timeline.
We don't have a Monroe Doctrine the way it happened in our timeline.
Yeah.
I think I'd be open to arguments as to whether it does exist or not. I think the forces that led to the proclamation of the Monroe Doctrine, no extension of European colonialism in the Americas. I think most of us know Great Britain was going to issue it was going to be like a dual proclamation.
Yeah.
The United States and Great Britain were going to say it. because we were interested in maintaining the independence of the new South American states. And Great Britain was very interested in maintaining free and open trade with those states. Nothing we have talked about whatsoever challenges anything about British access to Argentine beef.
Yeah, but I don't.
And so,
what I'm getting at is it's less of an overt thing. It's more of a it's more of the big stick and less of the walk softly, to use a Teddy Roosevelt aphorism.
I think with America being maybe a definitely a regional power in a way it wasn't in it wasn't in our timeline. And you say that maybe the 59 war is what opens Fernando's eyes to the wider world, but he doesn't move against British Columbia if he's not paying attention.
Yeah,
we're already involved, and we've already driven out one of the only significant colonial presences in the Americas in our timeline. Nobody has a foothold over here to do anything.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So, kind of moving the ball down the road now, we have basically in the 1850s and 60s a America that is much larger, much more pluralistic, and now the question becomes, and this I think can kind of start us into either the next part of this episode or maybe possibly the following episode. But when and where does what happens in our 1850s, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Bleeding Kansas, all of that stuff that it leads to, that plants the seeds for the Civil War. When and where does that happen here? Because in our timeline, and this is something that we did not really discuss up until this point, but in our timeline, Prince Ferdinando actually dies age 32 in 1855 because of some wars that he was involved in, and that did not really do a lot for his health. So over here in America, I think before we hopped onto the air here, we were like, yeah, let's give him a few extra years of life because
he
he's
makes
not
it to
involved
1860.
Yeah,
I think that makes sense because he's no longer involved in those wars, and he has a little bit of time. But now, and I think this is probably where we can maybe just start thinking about what's going to go on in the next episode. What happens now that Ferdinando passes away in 1860, a few years after he did in our timeline? What sets the stage for our timeline's version of the Civil War?
So I think we said he probably makes it up to 1870 for the big reveal that'll come next episode.
Okay.
Or at least late 1860s.
Yes.
Let's say late 1860s.
Yeah, 1860s. Yeah. The one thing I'd say is I don't think you have Bleeding Kansas.
Nope, you don't, because there's a certain amount of territory that we have to play with. We're cool with that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think there isn't really the scarcity that's forcing the conflict that we see.
And to bring in a reference to another episode, the So What SoCal, in that episode, I believe it was Chris and Don who talked about Northern California and Southern California, Southern California being a slave state. Kind of similar thing, but on a much more blown up scale here in this timeline. We don't have the same pressures necessarily that leads to such explosiveness on the political landscape. We also don't have, quite frankly, as feckless and ineffective as leaders as we did in our timeline that we do, or that we don't have in this timeline. We have what I would say a pretty effective leader, and we also have much more stability because we don't have administrations changing every 4 to 8 years. We got guys who are living for at least over a decade in their American kingship. So I think that is probably as good a point as any for us to call this a wrap. And we covered the reign of King Ferdinando in this episode. Are there any other dying or burning thoughts or questions from any of you gentlemen before we wrap things up?
Nothing jumps to my
I-
mind. Anybody else?
I think we're there.
I think we did it.
Silence
Good to
speaks
go.
volumes, I
Yep.
think.
Silence
Cool.
speaks volumes. The silence is deafening. All right, guys. Well, if
we
you
have- we
enjoyed
have
this
British-
episode,
Just to wrap it, so we've ended in around 1868-ish. King Ferdinand is
On his last legs, if maybe not dead
approaching
yet.
the end of his life. We have managed to set up the state of Deseret. We have taken over British Columbia and connected Alaska to the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And we did not pay for the Gadsden purchase. We might have paid for Columbia as an alternative. And so we've got plenty of. Did we form the Dakotas yet, or did we just let it sit there?
I think we
I was
admitted
trying to
it.
remember where we landed with Dakota.
Yeah.
I think Dakota was just thrown in as a single state.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a
Okay.
territory. Maybe it's not.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a state yet. It's a territory.
And in honor of Eric Rush, Wyoming never exists.
Yes.
Yes.
Oh.
So
hmm
It's Desert. It's Desert Junior in this time.
there you go.
There you go. There
Oh,
you go.
and I'm sorry, Boise is the new Dublin.
Boise
Yes.
is the new Dublin.
I
You
did forget
gotta-
that.
you
Because
gotta have it
the
there.
potato farmers from
Yeah.
Ireland,
Ireland, they
pretty
just
much
go straight out there.
because
straight
we
out
had a
there.
transcontinental railroad to get them there, so they settled there, and it becomes their big settlement.
Perfect. All right. Well, this is the kind of stuff that we men like to talk about and throw around on our weekend evenings. And thank you all so much for tuning in and listening along with our little thought experiments and ramblings. And I think I'll end us off with the favorite way that we like to end off all our episodes. If you happen to stumble across a fork in time, what, pray tell, do you think we should do with it?
Take it.
You should
All
always
right.
take that.
We should always take that fork. See y'all next time.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.